at the effect of the pandemic on the world's economies. Let's bring in the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg now. Treasurer, let's start with this quarterly number. In your mind, does this mean we've dodged a second recession?
Well, certainly it's a solid growth number for the June quarter, and it's better than what the market was expecting. And indeed, if you look at the financial year 2021, we have seen growth that is stronger than what we forecast in the budget as recently as May. The number did take into account the impact of the lockdowns, particularly because 29 days in the June quarter saw lockdowns at least in one part of the country, and 4 of our largest states have actually been in lockdown over the course of that June quarter. That being said, the full impact of the lockdowns in New South Wales and Victoria will be seen in the September quarter, which, as I've said before, Kieran, is expected to be negative and to see the economy contract by at least 2%. As for the December quarter, that is yet to be seen too, but we're very hopeful that the economy will bounce back strongly in the December quarter once restrictions are eased, particularly as we're getting very close to those 70% and 80% targets.
Given how much the health story is central to the economic story, how much has the vaccine rollout, the slow vaccine rollout, how much has that cost GDP?
Well, the vaccine rollout's actually been gaining pace, and we've seen people right across the country roll up their sleeves. Well, obviously, the vaccine hesitancy was real, and that has started to decline, and no doubt driven in part by the lockdowns that millions of people in New South Wales and Victoria, and supply issues are real. And the fact that the PM was able to get the extra doses from Singapore, the extra doses from Poland, and of course the other contractual agreements that we've had with the other suppliers has meant that more supply is coming online, and that is helping to see those vaccination rates increase quite dramatically. But the Delta variant has changed the game, and you heard today from Premier Daniel Andrews an admission that the virus can't be eliminated, that the Delta variant, unlike previous variants, can be suppressed, but not to the point where you can totally get it under control. And that is a welcome acknowledgement of what is a very difficult situation.
Yeah, I'll ask you about that. I'm very keen to explore that, because that's a pivotal moment in this pandemic response. But on the slow vaccine rollout, have you had numbers done in terms of the impact of not getting the supplies when we wanted them, the impact that that's had on our economic growth? Because we're in the severity of the lockdowns now because we haven't had the supply earlier. It's as simple as that, isn't it?
Well, we made some assumptions in the budget as recently in May, and one of those assumptions was that everyone would be able to access the vaccine by year end. And we're on track to do that. And we're making up good ground with the vaccine rollout. Another assumption was that the international borders would gradually open from mid next year. Now, again, we will revisit those assumptions based on the medical advice and based on the developments on the ground. But certainly the vaccine rollout is really building momentum, and we've now got a plan, a very clear plan that was set out at National Cabinet, that was agreed at National Cabinet, that's based on the best medical advice from the world-leading Doherty Institute. And just today, Kieran, you've seen 80 of our largest business organisations go public with their call for state premiers and chief ministers to stick to that plan, because that plan gives their business.
Do you agree with the Attorney General? Because it's relevant to the point you're making about the businesses and saying stick to the plan. Do you agree with your colleague Michaelia Cash, where she says that the constitutional power of the states diminishes in shutting their borders once we get to that 80% threshold?
Well, Michaelia Cash has been very clear that we don't have any plans to bring constitutional challenges in relation to those border issues. What we have said is that we want the states and the territories to reopen in accordance with the plan. And at 70% and then again at 80%, you see that easing of restrictions. It would be ridiculous, Kieran, that we would open international borders for someone from New South Wales or Victoria to go to Canada before they could go to Cairns, or that somebody could go to Bali or Singapore before they could go to Perth. And we know that there are many tourism businesses in the Gold Coast, on the Sunshine Coast, up in Cairns, or indeed in Broome or other parts of Western Australia that are doing it tough right now because of the lockdowns in the southern states and because people can't move more freely across borders. So it's in the economic interest of those states to lift those borders in accordance with the plan.
I want to move, though, away from the discussion about whether or not there'd be court action and specifically go to your view. Now, the national plan isn't explicit about state border closures. Is it your view that they should end at 70 or 80% vaccines, or is it a matter for the states?
Well, when we get to 80%, I cannot see the need for state borders to be closed. I believe that at 70 and 80% we'll see restrictions eased across the country, but when we get to 80%, those borders should be open. One of the key economic issues facing the Western Australian economy right now is labour force shortages. And you've seen very prominent and influential Western Australians like Kerry Stokes and Rob Scott, who runs Wesfarmers, come out publicly and say that Western Australia, like the other states, should follow the plan. So there are real issues in the economies of Queensland and Western Australia that are coming as a result of those border closures. That's why it's in their economy's interests, and of course it's in the national economy's interests, that everyone sticks to the plan together.
Anastasia Palaszczuk said today, you open up this state, i.e. Queensland, and let the virus in here, and every child under 12 is vulnerable. What do you say to that?
Well, of course, we've got to be cautious about the virus with respect to the whole population, and particularly so when it comes to children. But again, the medical advice is being clear to date on this issue, that the virus is not as serious and the illnesses are certainly not as severe in children as they are in adults and other members of the population. And their advice is contained in the Doherty report. They've taken into account the situation of children in recommending a COVID-safe reopening of the economy at 70 to 80%. So we've taken into account the impact on children of the virus. And of course, we've got to have mitigation measures in place. And that's envisaged in the plan, that there will continue to be some health restrictions are in place. But Kieran, as a dad, you're a dad, we know how impactful, how serious the consequences of the so-called shadow pandemic is. And it's not just the outcomes with respect to COVID that we should be thinking about. We should also be thinking about the health outcomes with respect to mental health issues and depression and anxiety and all those and related eating disorders and all those other issues, which are now very much coming to the fore in the context of our younger people being subject to these lockdowns. I think it's a really serious issue, and that's why I say that the plan needs to be stick to, not just for the economic imperative, but for the broader health imperative as well.
Yep, and that's, as you alluded to earlier in the day, Patrick McGorry calls it the shadow pandemic. Should psychiatrists be involved in these decisions now in terms of reopening, not made by just the Chief Health Officer, but have the Chief Psychiatrist with them?
Well, the public health orders are decisions that are taken at a state government level, but I would assume and hope that those officials are taking into account the broad range of medical advice, including that that affects people's mental health. Because we've seen some of the numbers that have been revealed, Kieran. More than 340 teenagers a week are turning up at hospitals in Melbourne as a result of mental health related issues. This is more than 160% increase on the numbers that we were seeing pre-pandemic. In New South Wales, it's around a 50% increase. And I can tell you about the letters and the emails and the phone calls that I've received as a local member of parliament, no doubt exactly the same is happening with other local members, that the lockdowns are having a very severe mental health impact on not just young people, on the broader population. And that's why we must get the balance right. And that's why the announcement today by Premier Andrews was so welcome, because we can't eliminate the virus. We have to learn to live with it. And that means getting our kids back into the classroom as soon as it's COVID safe to do so.
Well, finally on that point, the Victorian Concession, you've been critical at times, quite famously critical on the floor of Parliament and so on. Now, on this day, when we'll look back at, I think, at this day, at the end of the pandemic, finally when we get there at some point in the future, but it was a pivotal moment. The Premier saying that they won't be able to eradicate this thing. Is that a positive step in your mind? Because it means that the state and the nation is starting to grapple with the reality.
Today was a turning point in Victoria. Make no mistake. A recognition by the Premier and therefore by his health officials that they continue to try to suppress the virus, but they can't eliminate it. There's no such thing as COVID-0 with Delta. And you and I don't know what the next strain will be sometime next year or even sooner. What we do know, though, is we have to live with COVID. And that means having an honest conversation with the Australian people as to the consequences of that decision. There will be serious illness, there will be hospitalisation, tragically there will be deaths. But if we don't live safely with COVID, certainly our economy can't afford it. The impact on businesses, big and small, will be immense, and particularly people's livelihoods and, more importantly, their well-being will be hugely impacted. And therefore we've got to follow the lead of other countries around the world as our vaccination rates get to that 70 and 80% and live safely with COVID.
Treasurer, I appreciate your time. Thanks.
My pleasure.